Hey folks, welcome to Your Basket is Empty. We are equal parts content and consulting. On the consulting side, we work with digital agencies to help them grow and scale by offering fractional director services. On the content side, we aim to inform, inspire, and entertain the modern commerce community. We do that with a newsletter, events, and a podcast. Welcome to our YouTube series. If you want to learn more, go visit us at yourbasketisempty.com. On this episode, I sit down with Isabelle Gormezano Marks, Marketing Director at the East London Liquor Company. We discuss what an analog-digital brand is, why tone of voice is the key to scale, how to balance customers and trade partners, building online and offline communities, and why brand activation opportunities, like what they did with Malin and Goetz, is so important. Isabelle, welcome to the pod. How are you and where are you?
Thanks, Tim. I am well, thanks. I am in my kitchen. It's a Friday morning and it's sunny outside, so there's very little to complain about.
It pissed down with rain yesterday, didn't it?
It did. I got caught in that.
Oh.
It's been impossible to choose what to wear the last few weeks, but I'm taking the challenge head on every day. I'm trying my best.
I was thinking about that exact same thing. I'm not a massive fan of transitional seasons. It's not my thing. I always get fucked up, right? Like I'm very prepared, so I've got my expensive bougie Arc'teryx jacket, but it becomes very muggy and warm, in these transitional seasons. So I've actually ventured out for the first time ever and bought an umbrella, which I'm not a fan of, and it's
Congratulations. It's quite
quite good.
British to do that.
It is. It is. I feel
Umbrella is
like I'm
very British
fully.
purchase.
I'm indoctrinated now into the British society, which I wasn't before.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Okay, so this conversation, as we were saying before we jumped on, is going to be focused on you guys and how you're building online and offline communities. But I usually like to do a little bit of a rewind and just get a sense of like, what is the East London Liquor Company for the uninitiated? How would you explain it?
Sure. I would say East London Liquor is a whiskey distillery that also makes gin, vodka, and rum. And we really exist to shake up the perception that whiskey is a buttoned up, dusty, fusty category. And we approach it in a very no frills, no nonsense way so that it's as approachable and accessible to as many people as possible because it's such a beautiful category. But I think a lot of people are very intimidated by how it usually presents itself. So we're here to offer a little bit more of a welcome to it.
Nice. And is that because who would be the stuffier sort of brands? Are there like more traditional ones
More
from Scotland and
traditional.
stuff like that?
We
Maybe we don't need to name names, but is that what you're talking
no,
about? Like
yeah,
from the Scottish
it's the
Highlands,
same.
that sort of thing?
It's the same as wine, old world, new world wine. There's
Mm.
absolutely no indication of anything is better or worse than each other, but they are different worlds that present in a different way so that consumers can interact with them differently. So I like the more old world categories of whiskey are beautiful. Japanese whiskey, Scotch, you know, Irish, American. Those are more established categories. They have a lot of rules and they have a lot of ways that they always behave. And when people think about whiskey from the UK, they usually think of rolling hills, antlers,
Yep.
tartan, a man
Yes.
with a cigar and a chair by a fire.
Yep.
And we're not saying there's anything wrong with that. We are just offering an alternative.
Got it. Okay. You've painted the picture very, very clearly in my head. So,
Great.
given the kind of the business model, I'm assuming you're quite physical in nature, right? A distillery is a very physical concept.
100%.
Talk me through, I suppose that, but more so your move to online. Like, why did you think that a direct consumer channel or an eComm sales channel was useful? And like what prompted that expansion? I mean, I've got some theories as to why, but I'd love to know from your perspective.
Sure. I think we're probably very similar to a lot of brands our age, which was that we dabbled in online just before the pandemic. And then as lockdown hit, it became a real source of maintaining our outreach and keeping linked with customers. So it's built from there and it's become a bigger part of the business. But I would say digital is very much something that we use to accent in real life marketing and activations, as opposed to being an absolute focal point to how we operate as a business. It's really important to us, but fundamentally, when you're making bottles of alcohol that cost between 27 and 65 pounds, the barrier to entry for someone purchasing through our web shop is so much higher if they have to fork out that kind of money for something they may not have tried before than if they're buying a cocktail gin and tonic for £8.50 in a bar, or a can of our RTDs in Tesco for £2.50. So it's really important for us to legitimize our brand online and to also retain customers. But it in real life is really where we're going to recruit new people because the barrier to entry is so much lower. So it's a real fine balancing act.
And that's a really interesting point. So I know you've got the mixer product that you talked about there. Do you
Yeah.
find from a digital or an online perspective that is a higher entry point in terms of conversion?
From the cans.
Yeah. So are people coming in? So obviously you're driving traffic and you're getting people to the site.
Sure.
You make a great point, right? Like as a consumer, high average order value product as that initial conversion might be difficult. Do you find more success with the mixes and something that's at a lower price point?
Do you know what? Not really, because we sell our cans in packs of 12 online. So their price point is the
Okay.
same as a bottle.
Interesting.
But what we do find is once people are buying online, they're usually buying more than one product. So we've already
Yep.
got them. They're hooked. It's just a question of what they get because we've already found them out and about. So they tend to be a much more intentioned customer when they find us online because they usually have had some interaction with us already.
That's really interesting. I think from a direct consumer proposition, right? Because it's so hard to acquire customers, generally speaking. So
Yeah.
you've got one that comes, they're already bought in. Therefore, your average order value must be pretty high. Then, once you've got them there, albeit
Yeah.
it's not easy getting them there. So let's talk about the customers, right? And we want to talk about community. So my sense is getting back to the business model, and you've got this physical nature distillery. We talked about before we jumped on the call the ritualistic nature of drinking and the coming together, right? So you kind of prime for community, I would assume. How have you found like moving that community, which is probably primarily offline, into online? Like, have there been hurdles? Do you think about them differently? Talk us through that kind of like I said. And do you call it community? Because I know that's even a contentious word, within the brand space, whether we actually call these
Sure.
things communities or not.
I mean, I call them our drinkers. I feel
Mhm.
like we're connected through the fact that they drink what we put so much love into making for them. So the connection for me is less about them coming into a club that we've built and wanted them to join us in. And it's more a question of it's being linked through, like we say, that ritual of drinking and coming together, which is something that the hospitality industry is so entrenched in and usually is what attracts so many people to the drinks industry from the other side of the bar. So that's really important to us. I think there have been hurdles, no doubt about it. I mean, in my previous role, we really grew an online community because it was a much faster moving consumer good. So people were topping up. There was a beer brand, and people were topping up on a case of beer every few weeks. Whereas people don't get through gin that quickly or whiskey that quickly. It's something
Mm.
that you
Hmm.
do just savor a bit more and have to hand for a little bit longer. So I think I've learned that the customers are going to behave differently through an online community to maybe my previous experiences. And the biggest hurdle I think is keeping a real laser focus on what we want to do rather than thinking that good digital marketing requires a packed schedule that you have to stick to religiously. I'm very philosophical with our approach to marketing now, where I only want to use digital if I think that it's a genuinely compelling conduit to getting a message across, rather than thinking everything we do must be translated online, otherwise it won't have happened and people won't know it existed.
That's a really interesting point then. So how does the going, high level from your previous experience to this, given the nature of the product and the fact that you've made a good point there, the repeatability of it is slightly longer, you know,
Sure.
how does that change your communication kind of strategy? Like, because I imagine you're like, do you have a deeper conversation with people when there's a longer time period, or is it ultimately kind of the same?
The nature of the conversation is the same. I would rather tell versus sell, and I found that really helps with conversion. So
Hmm.
a newsletter, or it'll never really be about discount now, buy now, order shipping in 5 days. If you order now, get it by the weekend. It's more about reminding people you're there and giving them more reasons to love your brand so that you are front of mind during those moments of intention for purchase.
Yep.
And that's not changed, but I think the expectations of what you expect from your audience has changed based on the products and the way that they behave in like a consumer setting, for sure.
And then I'm curious, that's super interesting, the way in which, the comms to the community or the drinkers or customers, um, how do you kind of like maintain that at scale, right? And I always think about the idea of like, when primarily maybe direct consumer brands or just brands are starting out and there's the handwritten nature of it. But then if
Mm,
you get really, really big, you can't do that. And I know there's technology that can help with that. You can send out what looks like handwritten letters or whatever. But like,
sure.
how do you guys think about it as you scale? And then I'm also interested at the same time, how do you balance that with like in-person experiences? Like how
Yeah.
do you scale both? Or do you intentionally don't do that because it's difficult to do?
So to answer the scale question, for me, like hands down, tone of voice is the conduit that helps thread through any kind of change in size. You have to, whether it's a billboard or a drinks coaster, the way you're talking to your audience needs to remind them of the reasons why they love you, and how you speak to them is almost more important than what you're saying. So that would be my number one thing that I'm always very careful to watch is tone of voice. I mean, the brand I used to work for is called Small Beer. They're a very, very different brand to East London Liquor. But in each time, I was very tight on the tone of voice, because that is how your brand actually communicates to a consumer. It's not as much the content of what you're saying as much as you might think it is. So I think that would be a really key thing to keep in mind when it comes to scaling. I'm so sorry, Tim. What was the other part of the question?
So then it was like, okay, so you're scaling, and that's a really, I mean, I want to touch on that. Like, how do you maintain that tone of voice? Maybe we'll get onto it in a second. But what do you do then from like an offline perspective? So tone of voice is kind of the thing that
Sure.
sits behind as like the key pillar, and that can be online, offline. But what do you do from an offline perspective that maybe then gets translated into online as you scale? Like, do you throw bigger and bigger events or bigger brand activations or whatever it is, or do you keep the kind of like in-person stuff small because it is more controllable and focus more on scaling like a digital community?
Sure. Okay, great. Well, I mean, I would say so trade, hospitality, bars, restaurants, that is a huge part of our business. It's how we have grown over the last few years. So that is the heartland of our distribution and how people find us. So that automatically becomes a very easy and natural like place to bed in as a brand, and reach consumers for the same reasons I mentioned earlier about being a low barrier to entry. So honestly, it's finding tight ways to turn up in a really consistent way in as many places as possible. So I would we have got a trade toolkit that really focuses on something that's easy to rinse and repeat, and for that repetition to be consistent, so that the
Mm-hmm.
touch points that you're finding consumers in across the marketing mix build the brand with them that way.
And then this is going to be a very basic question, and I'm changing gears here slightly. But behind the scenes, what are the mechanics of managing like your drinkers? Like, do you have you obviously have a team, but do you have like dedicated, I suppose if you were calling them community managers? Do you use particular tech or CRM? Like, how does it work behind the scenes? Probably more from a technical and people perspective.
Sure. I mean, in this role, I have been really choiceful with how we apply resource. I call ourselves, in my mind, we're an analog-digital brand, in the sense, which sounds very contradictory, but in the sense that we show up in real life, and that's really important. And then we find a way to tap into digital as and when it serves us in a very choiceful way. So as a
Mhm.
result, I don't have dedicated digital agencies. We have no ad spend. We don't even have a PR agency to help with SEO, or building a more of an online presence in a more traditional sense as well. So everything is very organic, and a lot of what you see from us will be from myself and our amazing creative, who's in my team, who manages to make any idea 10 times better. And I think because we are so agile, because we are so small with how we operate, it means that great ideas can get to the finish line really quickly. And I think it's the pace that we have with that setup that allows us to have such compelling content on a consistent level, which keeps people engaged and interested. So it's a very different approach probably to a lot of brands who are 3 or 4 years old, or who have a D2C focus. But for us, it really works because of the nature of our business, the size that we are at, and how where our sales split is as well.
And then, who do you look to for inspiration for this? Are there brands that you're like, okay, and I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be in your own sort of vertical, but like, do you look to brands for inspiration for this sort of stuff?
Oh, all the time. I mean, it's part of the job is being inspired by amazing organizations and people who are brilliant at what they do. I mean, I actually am very deliberate as well in looking to brands from different sectors to other drinks brands. I think it's really easy to get caught up in your own tunnel of your sector. So, I mean, favorite ones of mine are like Painter Jackets or Peanut, the
Mm,
chat platform for for
Nice.
women and families, and Heckles, like all different corners of consumer brands, but they all do very different things really well. And I take a lot of inspiration from those kinds of brands. I mean, one of my favorite anecdotes, I think, is something Painter put in a newsletter probably about a year ago. So I'm going to be paraphrasing really badly, but I hope they don't mind. They had a really beautiful newsletter that was about, the ultimate test for the power of a brand is the skateboard philosophy of whether back in the day a teenager or whoever would they plonk your sticker on the back of their skateboard. And the kind of the more current example now is, would someone put your logo on their laptop?
Yes.
Then
Yes.
you've made it, because they love you for no other reason than you are there and that they've discovered you. And funnily enough, I actually have a Painter sticker on my keyboard right now.
Hey, nice. That's so
But
interesting. That's a
it's
great
so clever,
analogy.
and it's stuck with me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. As a former skate rat, I can totally buy into that. Interestingly, yeah, I think skate brands are a very interesting concept unto themselves. But Paintner, I mean, they're great. I love their sort of like slow commerce sort of vibe,
It's
right?
beautiful.
The whole thing about it being closed and being thoughtful, and yeah,
Mm,
it's really interesting. I've been wanting to get those guys on the pod for a while. I do find it interesting though, because that isn't scalable. So I always wonder about that. Like, how is there a scale question mark that they're kind of coming to at some point? Do you know what I mean? And it's like
yeah.
they're, I always think those sorts of models, which there's examples of before, like, is there a point where they get bought and then that magic goes? You know what I mean? Or do they not? They remain small and like slow forever. But yeah, I like the skateboarding analogy. Um, I want to switch gears back to, you talked about it before, trade, right?
Sure.
Couple of things. So I noticed you did a cool thing with, you had an account in Copenhagen and you gave them like a cool delivery, and you had these like, well, speaking of stickers, like temporary tattoos, and you obviously clearly were very thoughtful in the way in which you would, and I don't know if you call them a trade partner, but let's just assume you call them a trade partner or a company account. How do you think about that? Is that a whole separate community? Because you do have an unusual business model, right? You've got trade partners or account partners who are the conduit to potential consumer, but then you have direct to consumer as well. And they all kind
Sure.
of like, do you think about them totally different? Are they part of the community, or I suppose they are drinkers sort of, because they might consume your product, but also they are an account? How does that kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, Tim, you picked up on a really interesting part of the job there, I think, because trade is a huge customer for us, just in terms of the volume they go through. We love Sally down the road ordering her whiskey and gin every month, but then if a bar group has 10 sites across the UK, that's a really important relationship for us to maintain and make sure that we're approaching it in a way that translates to them. But also, trade essentially are our ambassadors. They will be serving a drink to Sally down the road if she's out. So we need to make sure that, although slightly nuanced in terms of how we talk to them, we have to make sure that what we say to trade, we all want them to say to our drinkers too.
Mm.
So it's, we need that consistency and tightness of message. Again, these are my favorite words. I'm sorry if I'm boring people with them, but they are honestly, they are our North Star when it comes to making sure that what we put out there works. Because we can do our jobs 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and think we'd be bored of it all, but drinkers will see it for seconds and forget about it and need to see it again for that brand recall. So I'm not apologetic about rinse and repeating until the cows come home, and making sure that everything we do adds up, and it matters.
And I suppose, does that then mean, I suppose, going back to what you said before, the tone of voice is so important? Because I'm assuming that tone of voice, if that's the kind of key pillar or anchor, that doesn't change too much across each of those different types of personas, right? Someone that's like
Completely.
obviously invested in your brand and selling it on your behalf and therefore helping their business, but then also direct to consumer as well.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, I've only been in the role for just over a year now, and the business is almost 10 years old. We've had to wait a long time for the whiskey to be ready, because by nature it takes years to age and to have enough at scale to sell. So, I call East London Liquor a kind of awkward teenage brand, where we have really established distribution, good growth, solid reputation in trade, but the look and feel is brand new. It's only been around for a few years. We now have
Hmm.
whiskey, which is our core proposition. So, we're a medium-sized business, but we're a brand new brand. So we have to find a way to kind of go through our growth spurt as a brand in a way that also helps the actual operations and our real distribution maintain itself as well. So that's like a very interesting challenge. The growth has been intentional, but the brand maturing has been a little bit incremental and accidental, just because it's happened in a different order. It hasn't been a really clean building up from scratch all at once. So being consistent and being really, really clear on how we turn up as a brand has been something I've had to really focus on the last year, and do a lot of spring cleaning to make sure that all the corners of this big business are aligned, which takes a lot longer than if you're a brand new brand and you're starting everything from scratch on one piece of paper, and then everything gets added on from there.
Oh mate, that's a separate conversation.
It's a really
internal change
challenge
management. Yeah. It's change management, right? Like internal change management. Yeah. I want to stay on the trade concept here for a second.
Sure.
So it's interesting from the kind of like Shopify / direct to consumer world that there is a lot of gravitation towards, or the agencies will look at brands like you and go, oh, this is amazing, we want to work with you guys. But I think under the hood, my assumption is your direct to consumer channel is actually quite small compared to the overall revenue, right? And it depends on the brand and it depends on the space and all that sort of stuff. But like, what does your kind of mix look like? Is trade or retail? I suppose retail would be the other one, selling into like, Tesco's or whatever. Is that primarily the bulk of the business? And then the direct to consumer channel is about testing, learning, like learning more about your audience? Or am I wrong in that?
You're not wrong. I think it's a bit of a strange one in the sense that trade is our biggest part of the sales split. Grocery and D2C are more or less hand in hand, maybe a bit more weighted towards grocery just because of the nature of, we're in few retailers, we're in Waitrose and we're in Tesco. So that just spreads us all over the UK very quickly overnight. But D2C is relatively chunky in terms of the proportion of our sales, but it's slower and but it has better margins, obviously, because it's direct. So for me, it's just it's kind of the place that, like you say, I can test and learn. I can find out more about our consumers. I can see what messaging works best. I can see what creative ideas are landing, and it's a really good way to get confident with something before really big spend goes elsewhere. So it's extremely important to us, and it is a huge focus. I would say that the mechanics that we really prioritize when it comes to D2C is newsletters. I think social is still somehow getting talked about far too much, when really the holy grail for me is this way of turning up in people's inboxes in that much slower way with a lot more weight behind it. And that's really where you're going to convert. I think you have the potential to convert a lot more of a reader into a paying customer off the back of it as well.
It's interesting you say that. I honestly think it's such a sort of, I wouldn't say it's an archaic form of communication, but it's very old, right? Like email is not like a cool new, well, I suppose you could use AI to power it or whatever, but it's not like the new thing. How do you guys go about it? Like, what's your general CRM strategy? Are you trying to, like you sort of said, tell the story, it's slow, it's about tone of voice. Are you trying to, and do you know, I'm curious, like, and maybe this goes back to the tech, like of your like CRM database, how many of them are like customers, or are you ultimately trying to convert them or trying to get them to convert their mates, or is it a combination of both?
It's always happening. So it's a moving beast, really. I would say, I did look at the numbers relatively recently for reporting, and I'm pretty sure at least 55% of our subscribers are regular customers. So they will purchase from us more than 3 times in the last 6 months, which is pretty good for the kind of product that we are. I would say my focus is to always build the audience organically. So making sure we're recruiting engaged people rather than huge streams of them and they don't open an email. So I'm not all about, ego stroking numbers. I'd much rather have a highly engaged database, which we do. We've tripled our size in newsletter subscribers, and we've maintained a 54% open rate, which I'm really happy about.
Huge. That's massive. Yeah.
But it's a slog to find those people and to keep them interested. We didn't have much newsletter to speak of a year ago, so It was more of a monthly roundup sort of thing, and now we have a welcome flow. I've changed us to Klaviyo instead of a different platform, and finding ways to, make sure that how we're speaking to them is not as a product, but as a brand, and as a almost like a personality, so that they want to hear from us. So that's been very interesting. And I mean, the recruitment of new subscribers, I mostly do through partnerships with like-minded brands from very different sectors to us. So I'm really passionate about cross-pollination across sectors, because I feel like if you turn up as an interesting drinks brand in a place they least expect you, you've got a great platform to be heard, rather than being in a crowded space where everyone's trying to say something very similar. So that takes time, but it's much more interesting work, and you find the right people through doing that. So I really couldn't recommend it enough.
So I know we talked about some brand activations before. I know you guys did some stuff with, I don't know how you pronounce it, Malin and Goetz. Is that how you pronounce it? Malin
I mean, the team call it Malin and Goetz, so I'm running with
Malin
that.
and Goetz. Okay, Malin and Goetz. I personally have a lot of their products. I think they're great. I'm curious then, I mean, talk me through that collaboration, but I'm also curious about like, how does that come about? How do you, did they approach you? Do you approach them? I'm assuming it's in the marketing plan somewhere, right? We want to do this. I'm assuming call it a brand activation. That might be totally wrong, but how does that all happen? Talk me through it.
So this is interesting. What we do is a real balance of forward planning, lots of hard work, and then just sometimes you get that golden ticket that you just can't say no to, and you race to the finish line to make sure it happens. And Malin and Goetz was one of those golden tickets where they were aware of us, loved our tone of voice, and needed kind of our personality to serve as a backbone to their creative concept. So they have this beautiful space in Regent Street, and the second floor of their store is an experiential space that they turn over every 8 weeks. So they had this idea for a rum bar, because they have rum products or rum inspired products. There's not actually rum in the candles or in the beauty products, but all of the aromas are inspired by rum. And they wanted a rum bar, and they just couldn't find a London brand that they liked, or a UK brand that they felt fitted the bill, until they came across us. And so I had an email from their marketing team asking if we would be interested, and we had a full events and partnerships calendar booked up. The stock was quite substantial because it's in the middle of Regent Street. It's for 8 weeks. It was I was like, this is either a great idea or a really bad idea, but instinct prevailed, and we were really lucky. It was a huge success, and they were an amazing team to work with. And I think because of the reason why they liked us, it was because of how we showed up and our approach. They're very no frills beauty, we're very no frills booze. That it worked very comfortably together. And I have a litmus test that I always use, whether it's coming up with a really big creative campaign or a tiny little partnership that only lasts for a week. If I can frame it in a caption on social media, on Instagram, if I can make it sound like us and get someone who has absolutely no investment in understanding what we're up to, I can get them to understand it and like the idea of it in a caption within the constraints of a word count, then I know we can make it work. And if I could do that, I could explain the rum room in a way that was compelling. And I thought, right, well, we just got to do this. So we did. And now we're back. We're now doing a second bar with them for their strawberry range with our Q gin. So I also really believe in partnerships that go the distance, and again, rinse and repeat. If it works,
totally
try fixing it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So a couple of things there. One, I've got their rum candle. Fucking smells amazing. Two, I think that's a really good piece of advice in the sense that I suppose all marketing plans have to have a layer of reactivity to them, right? But I think as marketeers, there is sometimes a reluctance to jump on things because of that unknown nature, right? I think you just got to sometimes fucking go for it and see what happens. And I think that the litmus test concept is a really... Did you do the litmus test before, sort of like either yourself behind the scenes or in your head before you pulled the trigger on this one?
Oh yeah, 100%. I do it all the time in my head. I just think out loud, does this sound like it would fly? And if it does, I mean, I think, you can plan as much as you like, but sometimes the luxury of time can give you too long to shoehorn a concept into reality, when really, if it can self-manifest into something that is exciting and interesting, then you just got to go with it. I find constraints, there's no denying it. We are a lean team for the size that we are. our output is quite incredible as a business. I was really pleasantly surprised when I joined the business exactly who is in charge of what and how much we're able to make happen as a team. It's a really big testament to how hard everyone works. But constraints keep things interesting because you have to be really intentional, really choiceful, and it means whatever we put out as brand, it's because we want to do it, not because we think we need filler and we need to be seen to be doing things. And so it means we can show up and really throw our all at it, whether it's something that's come through last minute or we've waited for it for 6 months.
That's so cool. Right. I want to start rounding out the conversation, and I usually project forward, and that is obviously interesting, but I've been introducing a more philosophical closeout to the conversation. I know, right? This is upon the advice of my mum, who was potentially the number one listener of this podcast, which is maybe a bit sad. Anyway, she's really, no, it's not. She's like an amazing person, and she's this like executive coach, and she's really in the space. So her comments are very, very valid. I'm curious what you've changed your mind about in the last 12 months.
Oh, well, if this is a philosophical question, I'm going to go deep with it. I hope you don't mind.
Let's do it.
I would say I've become more aware of how important it is how important it is to mobilize the collective, which sounds really vague, but what I mean is we have gone through such I don't know if I can swear on this. I don't usually swear.
I've said fuck like at least 3 or 4 times. You can
great. Went straight over my head. We've gone through such a shit show over the last few years. I'm sure everyone is aware, and I can't believe that we are still at a stage where we think that it will just sort itself out. And I think after lockdown, I thought surely people are going to realize that we have to act now, and that this can't get this bad again. And I just think I'm realizing that fragmentation across everything is so extreme that we really just can't rely on anyone to fix it other than ourselves. And that kind of daily activism is so important. And business is such a great focal point to start from. You can influence your whole business, your whole team on a daily level, which then seeps into their everyday outside of work. You can influence your suppliers and your partners, and then also your customers. And I just can't understand how this isn't a bigger part of business. And I think I'm becoming more and more frustrated with it the more exposed I am to other businesses, bigger businesses than our own, other sectors. And I just can't believe it's not more of a focal point. I think I was naively optimistic about it before. And in the last year, I've just realized it's just getting worse. We need to be talking about it more and being more uncomfortable with the reality that we're in. So a bit depressing. Sorry about that.
No. I mean, I think that this is the reality of the world. I mean, maybe this is a conversation for another day, but like, you're totally right. The populism that exists within society right now, which is being driven down by governments and populist right-wing contenders or people in power, is kind of insane. And I think you make an interesting point. Unfortunately, I think the further up the food chain you get, those businesses are very linked to those people. There's a very fine line between those people, those policies, and what they're about, right? So, and I suppose in this country, the activism piece is sort of being unpicked, through law, which is rather worrying. Okay, let's park that for a moment, but I think that's a very interesting concept. Final question. What's your favorite East London liquor-based cocktail?
Oh, it's so painful to ask me that. I would say a dirty gin martini or a rum daiquiri, depending on the mood.
What's the mood tonight, given it's a Friday?
Oh, it's a martini.
Martini
and Domino's got me through.
Martini. Now we're talking. Okay.
Yeah.
That is the
pizza. The playing of Domino's.
Well, the pizza could have been cool as well. But either way, okay. I think that's a great way to end the podcast. Isabelle, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me.